I'm Paolo Cuomo. I work at Gallagher Re. The context, I guess, of the quantum computing side more comes from what I've done over the last few years. Back in 2019, I said to a few people in the market, right, this whole quantum computing thing, do we understand what it means? And the general consensus was not yet. And then I said, look, we've got to do something. This is where Gary and I have a tight bond, yeah, because whilst it's not the topic of this conversation, he is absolutely clear on how blockchain is going to save the world. And I'm absolutely clear that blockchain may save the world one day, but all that it did for us over the last sort of 5 or 6 years is distract senior executives. And what that meant was that I think some of them got very frustrated with technology. If we think back, 15 years ago, senior executives didn't care about technology fundamentally. It was something that, you know, if the COO or the CIO insisted on a tech talk at the Exco, they might get 5 minutes. And if they were really lucky, they'd sort of get 5 minutes a year at the board level. And what's happened over the sort of past 10 years or so, we've had executives both understand technology better and understand the reason that they should be listening to technologists in their company. And that's a great step forward. And the disservice we did to ourselves with blockchain was that we overhyped it as a technology, which meant loads of people invested loads of time, not too much money, fortunately, but loads of time in understanding it. And then when it didn't deliver in the near term what it needed to, it wasn't just, oh, blockchain's crap, but it turned into, oh, technology over promises. And what I wanted to achieve with quantum computing back in 2019, when it was clear that it was going to start to be a thing, was how can we manage a dialogue, and this is sort of cross-industry, but obviously here we're talking insurance, and my background is insurance, have a discussion around sort of at the right pace, so that we introduced the concept in a way that meant that the people who needed to care, needed to think about it, were thinking about it in sort of the right timeline, rather than them saying, oh God, here's another of those shiny technologies which sounds great, but we've no idea how it's going to give value. So that's when we founded Quantum London in 2019, and we started having really good discussions, because it's the London market, they all started in bars over a beer, and it got a little bit more structured, and then we had a great conversation at BMS, the brokers, physical, similar to this, sort of really starting to get into the topic. And then COVID hit, boom, and we moved online, and we spent 2 years, and COVID was a blessing from that point of view, because it was just at the point of quantum computing was starting to be something that people wanted to talk about beyond the purely technical side. It was sort of business people such as yourselves. And so actually by going online, suddenly it meant that we could bring together bigger audiences. It means we could get speakers who wouldn't necessarily travel from somewhere to talk to 20 people in London. They were quite happy to do 45 minutes of webinar from their house onto Zoom. Now here we stand in 2023. Jeremy, who runs Tintech, has been asking me for the last few years, you know, will you come and talk about this topic? It feels like it will fit perfectly on the innovation stage. And each time I said, there's nothing to say yet. And to some extent, I think there's still nothing to say, but what we'll do is we'll have an interesting 20 minutes saying not very much. Because my sense is that from a sort of paradigm-shifting point of view, much like blockchain / distributed ledger technology over time is absolutely going to have an impact, quantum computing is absolutely going to have an impact. And my sense is that we should all be what I call sort of hashtag quantum ready. So, you know, if you're sitting in the technology function, if you're sitting in the data function, if you're sitting in the risk function, having in your mind, you know, what it is you need to do in order to, when the technology is able to support your company, your clients, whatever it may be, in doing something more, then you're ready to go. Because I have a strong belief that being fast follower does not mean, you know, you're sitting around and then when it's the time you say, right, I'm now going to follow. Fast follower is much more like sort of in the 4x100 relay, where actually you don't stand there waiting to be given the baton and then you go. What you're doing is you're already starting to move. And my sense is that what we need to do with quantum computing is we already need to start to move. And that doesn't mean we spend vast amounts of money. It doesn't mean we spend vast amounts of time. It means we're at least cognizant, and I'll touch on this at the end, but at least cognizant of, you know, who it is within the organization who should care. What does it mean understanding it enough so that if someone says, oh, let's do a project on this topic, someone might say, oh, that's interesting. Not tomorrow, but maybe in a year or 5 years, that's a topic that's going to lend itself to quantum computing. So I don't quite know how I jumped onto this in my excitement. That will have distracted everyone. But let's jump to it. So this here, naturally, let me explain. So I know about insurance. This is my knowledge of insurance. This is my knowledge of quantum computing. The overlap between the two is very, very small at the moment. And we were talking, some of us in the room before we started, that there really, frankly, aren't any experts when it comes to quantum computing and insurance. There's few enough experts when it comes to quantum computing generally, and the majority of them are quantum computing in terms of how to build these devices, how to write code that runs on these devices. It's very few people who would argue that they're experts in terms of how to generate business value. And certainly insurance is not one of the sort of jump to industries when it comes to thinking about use case. A little bit later I'll talk about where some of the potential use cases are cropping up. And then as Adrian was pointing out in our sort of pre-conversation, 18 months ago, we were sort of saying, right, quantum computing is going to meaningfully do things that normal computers can't. And that's still absolutely true in terms of there will be use cases. But if we look what's happened over the last 18 months in terms of sort of the ongoing rise of high-performance computing, I think we're, certainly those of you who are sort of more technically minded, I think you're being astounded almost every day as to what feels like almost an exponential growth of potential of just classical computers. Now, that does not mean they will be able to do things, some of the things that quantum computers can do. There will always be a paradigm that is better suited to the quantum computing side. But it does sort of slightly change the dynamic where we were sort of thinking of normal computers almost sort of got to an end point. Now, what are we talking about quantum computers? So, traditional computers, bits, right? So you will all know, I suspect, having chosen to come to this session, but you know enough about sort of underlying technology that everything from your smartphone to your laptop to your car is doing everything using bits. So bits are ones and zeros. A quantum computer uses something called qubits, which is obviously just a shortening of quantum bits. Now, I still struggle. I don't struggle, I just fail when it comes to articulating exactly what's going on. But this diagram, which looks really impressive, and this is how the sort of physicists look at it, essentially says, unlike a bit that can sit as either a 1 or a 0, a qubit can have multiple simultaneous values, whatever that sort of conceptually means. And it was interesting, someone was posting on this very topic on LinkedIn this morning, and the way he was articulating it was, we have 26 letters in our alphabet. Therefore, if you want to write a certain number of words, it becomes a certain length of letters. If you had 1 million letters in your alphabet, then you could write your words just using 1 or 2 characters, 1 or 2 letters. So there's a sort of a sense that what you can do with qubits is much more than what you can do with bits. Now, someone once tried to explain it. If you toss a coin, right, if it's either heads or tails, we all understand that, but on its way up and down, it's got sort of simultaneous values. Again, I don't think if there's any true physicists here, I think they'll say that's a very poor analogy, but it sort of gets you starting to think. Now, my comment is always, let's forget about this, let's forget about this, and let's just think about what it means in reality for us as either business people or technologists serving business people. And the way I sort of describe it is this. If you've got 2 salespeople in the US, you've got Claire and you've got Fred, and they both drive around and you give them nice, shiny, fast cars, and they'll drive around doing their sales work. And then you say, hey, Fred, we're going to give you an aeroplane. Or even better, we're going to give you a helicopter, so you don't even need to get to the airport. What Fred can suddenly do is he can get places faster. Yeah? And so Fred can suddenly do more meetings by shortening the length of time it takes for him to get between his meetings. And so Fred's chuffed, and he says, this is the future. And Claire's getting a little bit jealous here and saying, okay, I want a bigger plane, a faster helicopter, whatever it might be. And you say, no, hang on, slow down. We're not giving you another means of transportation. What we're doing is we're giving you video conferencing. We're giving you Teams. We're giving you Zoom. And what does that mean? That suddenly means that Claire can have those meetings. It just sort of likes jumping, doesn't it? Claire can have those meetings without having to move. And so there's a paradigm shift. Because however fast the plane you give to Fred, he has still got to get from Chicago to Los Angeles to Rome to wherever it might be. And he needs to sort of think through that. Whilst in Claire's case, she's able to, without moving from her desk, she's able to say, right, I've got a video call here, video call there. Oh, I can pull in this expert from South America to join this call, etc. So what's happening is that fundamentally she is still having client meetings, just like Fred's having. But the paradigm changes, she can suddenly use her day fundamentally differently. And that's how I sort of like to say, we think of ever faster computers allowing us to do the stuff we've been doing for the past 20 or 30 years faster and more powerfully. But if quantum computing turns out to be as we're thinking, what it's going to allow us to do is to do things differently. And that will be a benefit. Now, it's some years away. So this slide that kept wanting to jump up, this is, and it's purposely small and hard to read, this is IBM's roadmap. Now, if we think back just from a timeline point of view, this all started in the 80s and 90s and really got going just over the last 4 or 5 years. And this is Google building a 54-bit quantum computer. This is China now a 60-bit, 433. There was another one announced the other day. Now, this is, those of you who are mathematicians, this is really quite frustrating. Those of you who are mathematicians will see this as the beginning of an exponential curve. Now, that's important because the sense is to start doing useful calculations, we're going to need thousands, tens of thousands, millions of qubits. So whilst from a technical point of view, this move from 54 to 60 to 433 to 1,000, etc., is phenomenally impressive technically and conceptually very exciting, it's still not much use when it comes to using it to do anything. So at the moment, anything you could conceptually do on one of these quantum computers, you could do using a simulator on a normal computer. So therefore, from a business point of view, you're not able to do anything meaningfully more. That's just a more readable version of IBM's roadmap. And what's important with this, not the details, but the fact that IBM is laying out very clearly what it wants to do. And it's only one of many players. There's most of the large tech firms are looking at this technology and a whole load of startups that are increasingly well-funded. And so what this sort of suggests for the people who, if we were standing here 3 or 4 years ago, someone put their hand up and say, look, we've been talking about quantum computing being here in the next 10 or 20 years for the last 20 or 30 years. I think we're now at a point where we're starting to hit this growth. And there's no reason to think that we won't be able to continue to the point that we have a usable number of qubits in a quantum computer. And by the way, just for those of you who've not touched on the topic at all, this is an image that you'll often see in the context of sort of any news article, magazine article on quantum computing. The actual quantum computer, the quantum chip, in fact, on this particular picture isn't even there. It would be here, and it's only this size. And there's a range of different quantum technologies, but the regular one, that size, all this is cooling and control mechanisms. And it's also very cool from a PR point of view, and that was a problem blockchain had, right? There were no sexy images, Gary. Quantum computing looks cool, and it looks complicated, and it looks expensive, so that's good. Talking about expensive, it's not just a buzzword. All right? And if we look at investments, and this is interesting, right? Because this chart was from last year, because it was looking at 2021 numbers, and it's already changing. But the investment in quantum computing was 5 times the investment in AI in 2013. So let's think about where we are now. We're 10 years from 2013, and AI, which was being discussed in the same way as we're sort of talking about quantum computing, there were obviously far more use cases in 2013 than there are for quantum computers now. But the point was that people were investing modest amounts of money in AI then compared to quantum computing now. And look where we are with AI now. And there's I'm not sure if there's any particular panels on it today, but the role of AI in disrupting everything is right at the heart of not only technology discussions, but right at the heart of every business discussion at the moment. So what that suggests is that if we're spending that much, investing that much in quantum computing now, it bodes well for impact and outcome over 5 or 10 years' time. And here are some of the names of players. Now, why aren't they working at the moment? They're not working at the moment because essentially they have to be, they're what we're calling, it's essentially noisy. What that means from a sort of underlying physics point of view is that you can't get the accuracy you require. So what all these engineers and technologists are doing is trying to work out how to improve the accuracy. Because you could conceptually build a quantum computer with far more qubits at the moment than we're using, but they wouldn't give reliable, accurate information. So there's no point in trying to scale them up if what you're doing is having to sort of double-check the answers that are coming out each time. So we're in this so-called noisy intermediate stage sort of quantum era, and what's going to happen over the next 5 or 10 years is that the technologists, sort of this really deep tech work happening in these large companies at the universities, is going to start to work out how to manage the accuracy. Right. So we talked a bit about problems, and this is a slide that IBM often use, right? That say, as humans, there's a bunch of problems that we can solve today, conceptually and with the computers we've got. And then this sort of big grey box, which are all the problems that we know about that we can't mathematically solve today. And what we're saying is that quantum computers will play a role in solving some of them, by no means all of them. But what gets really interesting, not germane to today, but interesting conceptually, is actually it's only once we have fully functioning quantum computers where we start to necessarily work out what all the use cases are. And the sort of slightly trite analog to this is if we talk about smartphones. When we had the first smartphones a decade or more ago, people were kind of quite excited because, hey, you could have all your photos on your phone, you could have all your music on your phone. I don't think anyone at that point was saying, hey, you can pay for your parking on your phone, you'll have your train ticket on your phone. And even if we'd got a bunch of smart people sitting in a room for days saying, what will be the way humans use smartphones in a decade and a half time, would have missed the majority of what we're actually doing. It's only once it comes out that a combination of sort of creative innovation and capitalism drives ideas. So this whole bit here is actually quite interesting because there'll be questions we didn't even know we needed to ask that suddenly we'll be able to answer. So what is being considered? I said insurance isn't a sort of particular priority for those people thinking about quantum computing. So optimization, one thing that people believe quantum computers are going to be very good at is optimizing maybe relatively small volumes of data, but very large combinations. So there's a problem called the traveling salesman problem. And this is if you have a person who's got to move between a certain number of cities, what is the optimal way to get them between those cities based on certain parameters to do with distance, time, petrol usage, etc. And that is a problem. If you've got 10 nodes, it takes a certain amount of time. Using classic computer, if you add an 11th node, it takes a whole load more time. If you add a 12th node, a whole load more time. And that rapidly becomes unsolvable, even to our discussion, Adrian, with the most powerful computers we've got. The way a quantum computer approaches that problem means that it is not bothered, frankly, by the number of nodes. So if you add a second node, a third node, a fourth node on top of what you've got, it takes a bit longer, but not meaningfully longer. So any problem where you want to optimize around nodes is important. Now, you might be thinking, well, yawn, how important can that be? Well, actually, you can dig rapidly into any number of industries. So clearly someone who's delivering parcels around wants to optimize that, but also someone who wants to move airplanes around. And you can think about a whole load of physical things. If you work at Intel, then actually you're trying to optimize of the billions of chips on your microprocessor, you're trying to optimize for the connectivity between the billions of transistors on your chip. You're trying to optimize. So the type of optimization that a quantum computer is going to help that we can sort of easily understand in terms of getting a truck or a delivery person to the right place is actually relevant, for example, in microchips as well. There's a school of thought that says quantum computing is going to be very useful for simulating sort of real systems being biological systems, chemical reactions, etc. And the idea there is that can there be a whole bunch of drug design that is done on the computer before it needs to be done in reality, therefore compressing timelines. Or vice versa, maybe you've done the first bit in reality, but then you want sort of variations on this drug design, maybe to suit people with sort of different genetics. Could you use the quantum computer to shorten that? And actually, if we think of one of the areas that it's being looked at very seriously, it is by some of the drug design companies because they see a real potential to compress their R&D cycles. Similar concept, new materials. There's a whole load of simulation that, in theory, can be done with quantum computers around, potential new materials. Again, cutting out stages of the R&D process, shortening it right down, leads to EV. Some people look at the fact that some of the car manufacturers are looking at quantum computing, and they presume it's just to try and optimize Google Maps for the sat-nav, which is great, but is not necessarily a smart use of billions. If, however, by looking at materials differently, you can optimize the way that you're building batteries, then we all know the biggest challenge when it comes to EV rollout, is the cost, the reliability, the weight, etc., and the need for rare earth metals in batteries. And, so those two are nicely connected. City planning links here. There's so much data available now to a city planner in terms of who's walking when, what trains link to what, which traffic lights change at what time. That information is all available. If you try and turn that into a simulation, your computer breaks. Now, as you use more and more compute power, you can increase the size of your simulation, but in theory, a quantum computer can help you with that. And then because no talk on technology will be complete without climate, a lot of these points play into our battle around climate change. And one of the areas in particular, some 2% or whatever of the world's natural gas is used to produce fertilizer through some process called the Haber-Bosch process, which is over 100 years old and basically hasn't been optimized. The sense is that if you can use some of this sort of quantum approach to process optimization in materials, you can actually change how you're making fertilizer. Boom, suddenly you've saved 1% of the world's gas usage in one go. So this is, to my mind, where it gets more interesting. On the insurance side, if we had a little round table now and talked about how it'd be used, I think we would underwhelm ourselves. We'd say, hey, we do Monte Carlo simulations here, or we want to do fraud detection here. But actually, I don't think any of those are exciting in the way that, in terms of getting people to invest in the way that these are exciting for executives in those industries. So the way I look at it as pertinent from the insurance side actually is much more through the lens of we're underwriting risks. And if a new technology comes along, what does that mean in terms of the risks we're underwriting? And my sense is that most of this is not changing the risk. If we were having a talk now on 3D printing, if we were having a talk now on generative AI, anyone who's an underwriter or an actuary in the room knows they're nervous because they don't understand these new risks. And certainly sort of nanobots and nanomaterials over the last few years of the new technology have been getting all sorts of people nervous about what that might mean from an insurance point of view. I don't think quantum computing is something that should be getting our underwriters or actuaries nervous, with the one exception that some of you have heard about, which is that the same maths, essentially, that can solve this type of thing can also decrypt a lot of standard encryption methodologies. So there's a whole load of talk on about the quantum apocalypse and the idea that suddenly overnight, when we have a quantum computer, then we're going to be able to hack all of the internet and all of our protected data. And I guess there's 2 points of view. One is that we're not going to have quantum computers that powerful for a while, so we're probably going to be okay. The flip side is upgrading IT systems, as we all know, takes an awfully long time. So it may take 10 years before quantum computers can decrypt our encryption, but if it takes us 15 years, or even if it takes us 10 years, we don't start for 5 years to upgrade our IT, is there a clear and present danger? And that's something that every CIO and every CISO should have in their mind. The other intriguing side of that is something called Harvest Today, Decrypt Tomorrow, that says if you've got some data that is going to be valuable in 15 years' time, and most of our data isn't, but if it's medical data, certain financial data, government data, that could be valuable in 15 years. Well, you steal it now, you don't tell anyone, so they don't realize it's being stolen, or frankly, you could tell them, but you've stolen it anyway, and then you just sit on it over here. And then when you've got the quantum computing power, then you decrypt it and do whatever nefarious activities. And what's intriguing is that people aren't going to have to buy their own quantum computers. You're going to access quantum computing via the cloud. So you will buy a second or a minute or an hour of IBM quantum compute time. And the algorithms that decode encrypted data can't be spotted. So therefore, it will just run as a mathematical algorithm. So there's an absolute sense of we've got to get our head around what that might mean. So I've only got a few minutes left, sorry, because I got a little bit excited and carried away there. I think the last point to make is moving too slow an existential risk? And my sense is no, right? Many of you will have seen an equivalent of this image, and I used the same one back in 2016, and this was incumbent insurers, and this was insurtech. And if those of you who are looking at insurtech, sort of back 7 or 8 years ago, the insurtechs were all going to come in and they were going to kill the dinosaur insurers. And of course, most of the dinosaur insurers are still quite happily around, and the insurtechs have either gone or they're quite happily selling their services to the dinosaur insurers. So that end of the world didn't occur. My sense is there isn't an end of the world with quantum. I do, however, think that you do want to start thinking about your quantum journey. So if no one in your company is talking about it, start talking about it. Work out who it should be talking about it. And I've written here clearly in capitals, not to be in the IT function. That's not to diss our IT colleagues. They're more than welcome to think about it. But if it's just being thought about as another type of technology, it's going to miss the point. The point needs to be, is it the actuaries, is it the head of data science, whoever it might be, that's trying to understand what this means. It's starting to talk about the potential partners he would work with, and it's starting to think about how you might experiment in terms of what you're doing with it. And if you are already aware and discussing your company, make sure it's going beyond discussion to sort of proving. Understand where you are in the value chain. Work out which of your partners upstream and downstream are starting to think about and have those conversations. And none of these things need cost much money. This is more about modest amounts of people's time. And what you can do, if you've got an individual in your organization who's so minded, is you can actually log on to an IBM quantum computer and run basic code using a language which isn't dissimilar from Python. So in terms of sort of helping to make people realize that this is a real thing, the IBM code kit is something called Qiskit, Qiskit, and you can go on there, you can write a bit of code, and it will, run for a nanosecond or whatever on an IBM quantum computer, and then you can have that person say, hey, hurrah, I've run some code on a quantum computer. So, my suggestion is think about understanding this enough in order to follow the change happening, because I think it is a meaningful, important paradigm shift that in 10 years' time will be where we are with smartphones now, i.e. it's just become ubiquitous, and if you're ignoring it, then you've completely missed an important wave. But don't leave panicking that if you're not investing millions in it tomorrow, that you're going to be in trouble. So I have very little time left, but would love to do a question or two in audience, and then we can maybe do more later. So.